So, good afternoon, everyone. We're very pleased to present this Amazon Devs Network Rede de Pesquisa em Barragens Amazônicas webinar today, special webinar. And today we're pleased to welcome Dr. Denielle from Northern Arizona University to our group. Dr. Perry is an assistant professor at NIU, Northern Arizona University, in the School of Earth Sciences and Environmental Sustainability. And her work focuses on how environmental institutions and values influence both the development and conservation of water resources, as well as the socio-ecological implications of these competing agendas. She draws on a political ecology approach to analyze water resources policy and management, adopting a mixed methods approach, and making use of both quantitative and qualitative analysis. She brings her expertise and plays a role as a faculty advisor to the NIU's River Research Group and the River Management Society's River Studies and Leadership Certificate Program. So with that, I thank Denielle for her time and for sharing her research with us today, and I'll pass it on to Denielle.
Thank you, Simone. I'm really excited to be with you all today, virtually, for this talk. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about my formation as a scholar advocate and how that's led into my research agenda, thinking about how to reconfigure river governance for ecosystem service protection and climate adaptation policy. So I'll start with a little background and then move into my prior and current research agendas. So I should start off saying that before coming to the Academy, I was a river guide for over a decade, and I worked in rivers all around the world. In 2001, I moved to Costa Rica to work on the Rio Pacuare, and you can see in this image here, that's me guiding a raft underneath the famous Huacas waterfalls. And I became sick with typhoid fever, and the woman in the other image, Sylvia Rodriguez, is a Quebecer Indian that lives in the Pacuare Valley. And when she found out that I was sick, she concocted a remedy and hiked out of the canyon and took a bus to the city that I lived in and brought this remedy to me to save my life. And I don't know if it was her remedy or the medicine that I received from the pharmacy that saved me, but her commitment to me cemented a commitment to help her save her river from being dammed. And I found out right around that same time that her river was actually in fact threatened by dams. This Pacuare River is considered one of the most prime locations in the country for hydropower development. The canyon in this image here was the site of a proposed dam back in the 80s. And then that dam proposal stream to the site where you see the fishermen using those traditional nets to catch fish. This river is home to the Quebecer Indians. It's a pristine river, it's free flowing. And so just soon after this period of time, I got together with some of the people that you see in this image to start the group Amigos del Rio Pacuare to save this river from dams. The group became really strong, really fast, amassed a large number of participants. There's over 70 members of the group. And in 2005, the city of Turrialba, where I lived, held a plebiscite to a vote on whether or not the people in the municipality were in agreement with any kind of dam development to be put on the Pacuare River. And 97% of the people voted no. This deciding vote was considered a victory in the global river conservation community. However, the following year, when the new president came into power, President Arias, he announced plans to pursue dam development in the Pacuare River Valley. And so this string of events, and that brought up a lot of questions in me. You know, what is driving the desire to dam this river, and how can a president go against the decision to protect a river. And so I went on to study the political economy of hydropower development in Latin America. And what I found was that there were national and regional, sub-regional, and hemispheric agendas for integration through free trade and infrastructure development that were driving the decisions to build dams, not just in Costa Rica, but all over Central America. At the time, there were over 300 dams slated for development in this very tiny region in the world. The idea is that these integrated electricity grids in Central America would link up to the integrated electricity grid in South America, the IRSA, and the Central American CPAC grid would also connect to the North American NASCO grid. And so these regional development schemes were essentially impacting the ability for people on the local level to protect their rivers. So realizing that in order to get permanent protection for the Pacuare, there was going to be a need to get the message out beyond the academic sphere. I co-produced a film that brought the issues of dam development in Costa Rica to light. In 2015, at the 10th anniversary of the Plebiscite, this film was broadcast across Costa Rica and social media. And it was also shown to the president, the now president of Costa Rica, Solis, and then he was taken down the river. And through this action and his interaction with the river and the riparian communities, he signed a decree stating that there would be no large dams on the Pacuare River for 25 years. However, this decree could be undone by the next president, who's set to come into office just here shortly within the next month or so. And so in the absence of a river-specific conservation policy, we see that a plebiscite and a presidential decree really don't do the work of permanently protecting these rivers. And so, in fact, around the world, there are very few rivers that have permanent protection, a very small fraction. And this is really because of that nature as resource versus conservation of nature paradigm. And so as conservation is recommended for ecosystem protection, more and more so to protect the endemic species that are in rivers, or those species that exist only in one place in the world, and the other biodiversity that rivers provide habitat for, and the ecosystem services that rivers provide to society, we see that there's increasing demand for water resources from rivers to meet growing populations and increased energy demands, increased water demands. And so this actually puts these endemic species and the riparian communities at greater risk. So trying to understand, okay, if we have these regional and hemispheric global pressures on rivers, how do we really get conservation policies created and applied so that we can have ecosystem-based adaptation policies for resilience, for species, and for water security? As we see the push for more conservation policy, we also see a push for technical infrastructure solutions to what is this perceived water scarcity, especially in the face of climate change. Just a couple weeks ago here in the United States, the Trump administration announced plans to increase the height of the Shasta Dam, an action that is really set to drown out some of the last remaining cultural sites of the Winnemem-Wintu tribes on the Cloud River, which is a state-designated wild and scenic river in California. These moves to augment infrastructure as well as build new hydropower projects in rivers around the world really create this clash between the conservation and the development interests. So thinking about, well, how can we get conservation policy applied in this current state, I turned to this piece by Parenti, which suggests that in order to create and implement conservation policies, that it really takes a strong state presence, because the private sector doesn't have the capacity to implement conservation policies on a large scale, nor do they have the interest in so doing. The state really has the economic power and the policing power to enforce policies as well as implement them. And so Parenti suggests that in order to have the state apply conservation policies, that they should actually look to the legibility acts that the state is already conducting over its water resources or other resources that are in need of conservation policy. So you're probably asking, what is a legibility act? Legibility acts are, according to political territory theory by Scott, legibility acts are the state's way of controlling territory and governing its resources by making them legible through exercises that survey the resources, create inventories of those resources, catalog them, making policies to protect and govern them, and ultimately managing those resources. And so thinking about legibility and what types of legibility acts governments already have for river resources, I turn to the National Wild and Scenic River System of the United States. This is the 50th anniversary year of the Wild and Scenic River System. And so I set out to explore how federal river conservation policy has been applied and how legibility plays a role in the creation and application of this policy, and whether or not we can actually use this policy as a potential climate adaptation policy. So to do that study, I did use a mixed methods approach, which consisted of 50 interviews with federal land management agencies, with conservation advocates from the two national river conservation groups here in the United States, American Rivers and American Whitewater, and with technical experts that work with the Wild and Scenic River System. I also did archival research at the LBJ Presidential Library Archives in Texas. That was the precedent under which the policy was finally codified. And then I coupled that with database analysis of a database that I created that had everything to do with wild and scenic rivers. So what rivers were protected, how many miles were protected, what year they were protected, the presidential administration, congressional delegations, what resources were being designated for protection and enhancement. And through the database analysis and the discourse analysis of all the archival data and the interviews, I came up with this set of 6 broad categories of codes that really repeated time and time again in consideration of how this policy was created and applied and how it's managed and what works and what doesn't work with this policy. So first, what I found in the archives was at the time that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was created, it was during a period when the country was undergoing really rapid geographic and ideological changes about the environment. This was in the 1960s, the 50s and 60s was when it was being negotiated. It was during a period of rapid urbanization and population growth. People were realizing that there were finite resources. And as people moved to the cities, they were looking back at the rural areas, not as places where resources could be extracted, but instead it's these places where they could go and recreate or recreate themselves. The Outdoor Recreation Review Council actually stated that The people were suffering from mental health problems because they were working in the cities and stressed out by that kind of urban lifestyle, and that the rural areas that were being protected and utilized as recreation spaces were actually providing a service to society for public health. At the same time, this was during the Cold War era, when we were competing with, global powers like the Soviet Union, and protecting our natural resources through conservation policy was actually considered a geopolitical strategy to prove that the United States was superior on a global scale. So the conservation policies were seen as this sense of national pride, to build pride about the United States and to get other countries in the world to align with our agenda, our geopolitical strategies and agendas. So ultimately, in 1968, the policy was passed after 10 years of negotiation. And it's really considered by most people to be an attempt to reconcile that tension between the river development interests for dam development and the preservationist interests. But what I found in the archives was that this policy was actually a complex of multiple unprecedented policies that were all based in legibility acts that were set out to study and clean and protect and integrate the management of our water resources, enhancing those water resources for human development, for recreation, and for biodiversity protection. They were grounded in legibility and these notions of scarcity and security. And they reflect an era, this 1960s era of evolving national environmental priorities. This really comes to light in this notion of rational resource use, which factored into the emergence of a new water resource management paradigm at this time, using legibility as this lens, that's centering on the river basin as the organizing principle for integrating water management practices. This paradigm later became IWRM, or what we know as Integrated Water Resource Management today. And the principles in the forming of the Water Resources Planning Act of 1965 established water resource councils and river basin commissions to plan for the best use and development of water resources of the river and the adjoining areas. And what was the proposed Wild and Scenic Rivers Act at the time was taken into consideration in making basins legible to interests both for development and conservation. And the idea was that it was to create a flexible but systematic meshing of scenic rivers and comprehensive basin planning for the best use of the nation's rivers. So these conversations were integral to the design of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So I'll just go through a little bit the nuts and the bolts of this policy and how it works. So the 4 federal land management agencies, the National Park Service, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, and the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, were mandated to go out and survey all the rivers in their territory, inventory the rivers, and catalog those rivers that were free-flowing, segments of rivers at least that were free-flowing, with a high water quality, or at least the potential for restoration to a high water quality, that contain at least one outstandingly remarkable value, or what are commonly called ORVs. And those ORVs fit within these 8 categories of scenic, wildlife, recreation, historic, geologic, cultural, fish, and the other category, which actually plays a really important part in this act and its ability to function as climate adaptation policy. Once a river is protected, it establishes up to a quarter mile of a protected area in the riparian corridor to protect other values that might be in that corridor, like a scenic waterfall or habitat for some particular species. This established what is called the Nationwide Rivers Inventory, or the NRI, which catalogs over 3,200 rivers that are eligible for designation. And any federally funded development policy that could in any way undermine the free-flowing nature, the water quality, or the integrity of those ORVs has to undergo Section 7 review of the policy, which includes a NEPA analysis, which is an environmental impact assessment, to see how that would affect this river that is protected. So there are eligibility and suitability studies for the river that take into consideration the existing uses of the river and the projects that are like future water development projects that are necessary for the communities. And it takes into consideration population growth, water quality, biodiversity, integrative planning. And the act is actually really this unique policy that's designed with generalizable parameters that's intended for broad application across the United States. So to facilitate that application, there's a 3-tiered classification system of wild, scenic, or recreational, and a river could have segments that are designated any of those 3 classifications. The designation framework considers, as I mentioned, future development needs, and different levels of development are permitted within each of those different classification types. There are multiple methods to designate rivers, which take into consideration land tenure and water policy rights across the country. Ultimately, this policy really is adaptable to distinct water laws and property rights systems. It provides the IWRM framework for river ecosystem management. There are 2 main ways to designate rivers. One is from the states through the 2AII method. But those rivers already have to be protected in some sense by the individual states before they can get the federal designation. The most common way to get a river designated is through Congress or Section 5A. And this kind of substantiates Parenti's claim that it does take a really strong state or federal presence to both implement and enforce these policies. So thinking today, 50 years on, what, about the spatial distribution, how has this policy actually been applied in practice? There are 208 rivers that have sections protected as federally designated wild and scenic. That equals less than 13,000 miles. It's 12,708.8 miles. That 0.8 is really important when you're thinking about protections, when you consider that in this country there are over 3.5 million miles of river. You can see in this map the sinuosity, how many rivers there really are in this country, and how few are actually designated. So thinking about if we're going to use this policy for climate adaptation, it's really important to understand what is driving the kind of sparse application and the uneven application across the country. So one thing that I found in my interviews and through the database analysis is that to get a river designated, it really takes Congress aligning. And you can see here from this graph that 80% of all designations took place when Congress was controlled by Democrats. And ultimately, this has to do with what Harvey calls fear of dispossession by conservation. There's a lack of political will by the more conservative Republican Party that is afraid that conservation policy is going to impede their ability to develop and grow economically. I asked the database, you know, well, what does it take to get it, and what does it take to get a river designated? And the interview participants said it takes the stars aligning or the heavens aligning or some kind of magic. And I don't have any control over the occult. And so I asked the database, you know, what does it take? And really it is Congress, but at the same time, it's connection. It's the connection of people to the environment and their constituents. And you can see from this graph and the quote there that it takes someone in Congress to champion a river. And over time, there have been champions on both the more conservative and the liberal side of Congress, right? Or the Republican Democratic division in Congress, and even a libertarian has championed a bill to get a river designated. And this is really important because even when you think back to the case of Costa Rica and the Pacuare River, it wasn't until the president met with the advocates, went down the river, saw the film, and really came to understand the important role that the Pacuare River in particular plays to the society of Costa Rica, that he was willing to sign that decree. Thinking about, you know, moving forward with conservation policy application around the globe, it really is important to connect people, policymakers, with the river. So then thinking about what other things factor into the designation of rivers over time, it brings us to science. At the time that this policy was created, it was when ecology was really taking a center stage in political discussions and scientific studies at universities. And you can see here from this archival artifact that rivers were at the forefront of those discussions. This was at a time when rivers in the United States were catching on fire. They were highly polluted. Kids couldn't swim in the rivers. If people went fishing with their kids, they couldn't eat the fish because the fish were toxic. You couldn't drink the water out of the rivers. And so there's a major concern all across this country about pollution of our rivers and what that was doing to the species and what that was in turn doing to us. And so thinking back to all those water policies that were created at the time, it really makes sense that there was a concerted effort to protect and restore water resources in this country. So I found over 200 letters that were written to the president and to the first lady, from students to parents to business owners, pleading them to please clean up the rivers and protect the remaining rivers that were free-flowing and pristine. And so that all factored into the creation of this policy. And so I wanted to understand, well, how has other scientific advancement factored into the desert rivers, and has climate change played a role in the designation of rivers to date? So through the database analysis, what I found was that science really does play an important role, and you can see here that there's on the left-hand side of this graph, you have the main 8 categories of ORVs, those outstandingly remarkable values, and the other category is indicated in red. And on the right-hand side, you see that the other ORVs that have been designated over time really do take into consideration questions of ecological concern. So aquatic habitats, biology, vegetation, the riparian areas, traditional use by native peoples, hydrology, water quality, all those things, it show that as our understanding of stream ecology has advanced, that we've decided that those are also really important things to protect through this conservation policy. So some of the interview participants said that as we've had a greater understanding of how rivers function, that designations have moved away from that traditional kind of main corridor, main channel of a river in a steep canyon that's very scenic, to actually including designations of headwater streams and tributary streams because of this realization that they're so important to the integrity of the overall river system. I asked them if climate change has factored into designations, and in one case, climate refugia has been used in an eligibility study, in a very recent study in Montana. There's a group of headwater streams that are up for designation, and it's because they provide habitat for their cold water refuges for the native species. And so we actually expect to see those rivers designated soon. And this use of climate refugia in that other category really does lend to the idea that we can use this policy for climate adaptation, conservation of our rivers. The only challenge is identifying ORVs can be complicated because the system here in the United States is governed or managed by 4 different land management agencies. And you can see from these maps here that the regional boundaries, the regional jurisdictions of each of those agencies are different. But if each of those agencies are tasked with identifying ORVs, it's challenged because there are no standard guidelines for determining what a region of comparison would be for comparing one river to the other or one ORV to another. And the idea is that we're supposed to be identifying rivers that are regionally and nationally significant. So I asked them, well, what about using an ecoregion framework? Do you use an ecoregion framework to identify ORVs? And the interview participant said yes. But the problem is that even within one agency, the BLM, for example, in one area, in one of their regions, they use the Nature Conservancy ecoregion framework. And in another area, they're using the USGS framework. And this is a problem with all 4 agencies not having any standardized way to determine a region of comparison. And ultimately, this is a political geography problem of regionalization. How do you define a region? What aspects do you use to define a region? What gets included and what doesn't? And so thinking about using this policy for climate adaptation, I recommend that we actually use a standard ecoregion framework across the whole system, that all agencies would use the same framework. And I actually selected the EPA's framework because it's nonpartisan in that it wasn't developed by one particular land management agency. And this is one of the oldest ecoregion frameworks that's been refined over more than 30 years. And so using the level 3 ecoregion framework, we can see, well, what work has this policy done to protect rivers across the different ecoregions? What you see here is that one ecoregion has 34 rivers in the Pacific Northwest, but there are 35 ecoregions that don't have any protected rivers. That's 32% of the ecoregions with no protected rivers. Half of the half of the protected rivers are just in 7 ecoregions. So if we're thinking about protecting ecosystem services and biodiversity in our rivers for resilient rivers and climate adaptation, we need to do a better job. We need to get rivers protected in each of those ecoregions. And so, especially if we're trying to protect endemic species that exist in only one ecoregion or maybe only one river basin. So I have a project that's going to start in the fall with an incoming grad student and a couple people from the USGS campus here and some other faculty at NAU. to do some geospatial analysis of the nationwide rivers inventory. That list, you'll remember, that has over 3,200 rivers that are eligible for designation. And that inventory you can see in the map that's here on the right-hand side. You can, by comparing the two, the left side is rivers designated, the right side is rivers eligible for designation. You can see that by designating some of those rivers, we could really close the gap on protecting more rivers and therefore the biodiversity within those rivers. And so they're going to, we as a team are going to analyze the rivers on the NRI to identify a suite of rivers in each ecoregion that show the most promise for resistance and resilience to climate change and human demands, human impacts on the rivers, and then use that list to try to enable the agencies and the river advocates to proactively go out and get rivers designated, because proactive designation is actually a lot easier than reactive designation. I found that most rivers are protected because they have an imminent threat, but it's a lot harder to fight that battle when there's already a dam project slated for a river, say. If a river doesn't really have any major development projects proposed for it, though, the problem is that people are complacent and they think, well, there's no threat to the river. But we know that climate change really is a threat, even though it's not a visible threat necessarily written on paper. And so using climate change kind of as the catalyst behind, hey, you know, we need to go out and protect more rivers. Let's do that. But there are things that impact the ability for the system to function and do a really good job of protecting the rivers. There's a lack of funding that's appropriated by Congress. The budgets are shrinking every year for this type of conservation policy. There's that lack of political will. There's a lack of relevance about the policy. People don't understand the policy. They don't know how it works. But we know that during the anniversary periods, there's actually a renewed attention focused on these rivers and on the system. And this being the 50th anniversary year is a really great time to educate the population about the importance of river conservation and letting them know, hey, we have this policy that actually works. But this last quote that you see here has really driven a lot of my research on this project, thinking that the adjectives, wild and scenic, outstandingly remarkable values, just don't get politicians on your side. So if the day of the hippie tree huggers over, right? So people are not going to rally behind the adjectives. We need to go out and protect these wild and scenic places. But if you can frame conservation in terms of ecosystem services, then you situate biodiversity within the most influential political economic construct of today. It places the value on the services that the rivers are providing, like clean water, flood reduction, groundwater recharge, fisheries, recreation, and this gives policymakers tools to evaluate the trade-offs between development and conservation. Essentially, it's a means to an end for advancing conservation policy. And so I argue in my work that even though the term ecosystem services did not exist at the time that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was created, it very much was designed to protect ecosystem services. And this archival artifact here really exemplifies that, in that the Pacific Marine Fisheries Commission, which is a multi-million-dollar kind of governs a multi-million-dollar industry around fisheries in the Pacific Ocean, centered on salmon. They were asking for the creation of a river conservation policy that would specifically protect the habitat of the reproducing salmon species in the Salmon River in Idaho, which was actually one of the first rivers designated a wild and scenic. So even though scenic, these notions of scenery come into play in this policy, it really is about protecting the ecosystem services these rivers provide. So if we can frame the policy in that way, then maybe we can get the application of the policy advanced. So what I've done is I adapted Tickner and Ackerman's framework of the four main types of ecosystem services: provisioning, regulating, supporting, cultural services. And I situated all those ORVs that have been designated wild and scenic, or these ORVs have been designated for protection and enhancement in perpetuity, situated that within that ecosystem service framework to show the benefits that these rivers are providing to society by being protected. You get benefits like food security and public health, resilience, natural infrastructure, drought mitigation, flood mitigation, climate refugia, cultural renewal, scientific study, all sorts of benefits that actually are things that people can hear and understand more than those adjectives of ORVs. So once we have this ability now to communicate the benefits of river conservation in these terms that are germane to politicians and stakeholders, you can go out and you can talk to people and you can say, protecting that intact riparian floodplain or forest is great because there's cute critters that live there, but also because it's actually going to help mitigate against floods that could destroy your cropland or destroy your built environment, your cities, your housing developments, etc., that are within this river basin. So ideally, it can get people to listen. So then thinking more broadly about IWRM and how it's encouraged for developing countries around the world to not only take into consideration human water security, but also ecological security, we can see that this policy can actually be adapted into IWRM frameworks elsewhere in the world. And so that's the work that I'm doing now in China with a group of people who work for the Water Division, the Water Board of China, and some scholars from Yunnan University to understand how they can adopt the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Dr. Li Ping, who's in the blue, bright blue jacket there, standing just to my left in this photo, actually came to the United States a couple of years ago, Management Society meeting, to talk with me and other scholars who were there about the potential use of this policy in China. And the Chinese government has a couple of case study rivers that they're looking at for how to use our policy framework and apply it there. And now you're probably wondering, why is there a half-built dam in this picture if that's a study river for wild and scenic? Well, it turns out that they originally obviously had plans to build a dam on the Qingzhou River, or the Bamboo River, in Sichuan province. But they ran out of funding, and when they ran out of funding, it was at the same time that there was an earthquake there in 2008. And as people from around the world came to this area and they saw this river, as they were trying to help resolve the catastrophe of that earthquake, the idea sprung up about actually protecting this river instead of damming it. And so they left the dam, the footing of this dam, in the river as a reminder, almost as a memorial to this decision that this province has made, that they would no longer build dams in their rivers. So this river is really important because it's habitat to the largest amphibian in the world, the Chinese giant salamander, which can grow to be the size of a full-grown man, over 6 feet tall, hundreds of pounds. But it's also one of the most endangered species on the planet. It's evolutionarily distinct. It's considered to be a dinosaur, but it's globally endangered. And so protecting this river protects that habitat. This river also flows through, the tributaries of this river flow through the Panda National Reserves. There are geoparks there that are that commemorate the lives lost and the devastation of that humongous earthquake in 2008. There are really important ancient cultural sites all along this river system, and so they've deemed it really important for Chinese conservation. And there are several other rivers that they're considering at this time. Of course, my work in Costa Rica continues, thinking about how we can create a conservation policy in Costa Rica and what the policy framework would look like in other places, like in the Amazon basin, for instance, or in the Caucasus Mountains and in the southern portions of Europe. So thinking about legibility for river conservation, we can see that utilizing legibility exercises like these river surveys for water resources help to identify rivers that are significant, both socially and ecologically. It takes into account the long-term water, energy, food nexus planning for conservation planning. The design of river-specific policies based on linear features is really important instead of polygons. National parks where you draw a polygon around a piece of land don't work for flow resources, for fugitive resources like water, like rivers. And so to design a policy, it really needs to be river-specific. We can utilize that IWRM framework for watershed cooperation in conservation planning. And using legibility, we can prioritize ecosystem-based adaptation strategies for resilience. So those feed into my conclusions in that essentially resource-specific policies are really necessary for governing rivers and other resources in need of conservation policies. Legibility does work to protect and enhance river resources important to society. River conservation can be viewed as a state attempt to gain and maintain legitimacy on the national and international scope by providing a clean and safe environment for citizens. The distribution and the capacity of this system, however, are corollaries of evolving national environmental ideologies and knowledge grounded in the environment, and the pendulum swings based on administrations and priorities. But ultimately, this policy provides a really flexible, creative design for adaptation policy frameworks. And it can be used to address new environmental challenges in IWRM framework over time. So climate change is the new issue and will be for a long time. But as other environmental challenges surface, this policy can actually incorporate them into the planning and protection of rivers. And that's all I have. So thank you very much. Obrigada. I have about 10 minutes to take any questions that you have.
Awesome. I think so here. Or just the gallery view, the four. And then if she wants to stop sharing, you can wonder.
What can I go back to? I will find us. Where are we?
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
No, we're not. Okay, can you hear us?
Hello?
Hello, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I was trying to find us because we have a bunch of people now here, okay. And I was hiding them so we wouldn't, have the video. But it was awesome. It was so informative. I think it really targeted so many questions and topics we have been discussing in the light of the Amazon Dams Network engagements and discussions and reflections on managing rivers and policies for managing rivers with all the challenges ahead. So thank you so much, Denielle, and welcome to the network. And we're really looking forward to meeting with you in person soon. But with that, I'd like to open for a few questions from the attendees. And then I can enable your microphone. So David has a question. Yes?
Denielle, thank you. It's a great talk and a lot of places and a lot of policies. And so apologies if I missed this, but I'm interested to know, in the US, the National Wild and Scenic River and other sort of almost community or region-driven protection designations. I wonder, like, what do you think is the next step, or like the gaps in protection? Like, those designations are great, and I think they help sort of focus public interest, but they don't necessarily, for example, prevent treated wastewater discharge, permitted wastewater discharge, or they don't prevent, for example, land use alterations in the watershed or in the riparian zone. So they're representative of like an exemplary status, but they have, I don't know, like a policy backing, but they lack the teeth of regulation in many cases. So can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. As the resource management plans are updated, those questions like you mentioned of TMDLs or wastewater treatment effluent release into the rivers do actually come into play in the river management plans. And so if those types of discharges will in some way negatively impact the ORVs or the water quality of these rivers, then they can be stopped. There can be regulations placed on those actions. And you're right that it doesn't necessarily stop development within the riparian area of the sections of rivers that are not protected. So you might have a 200-mile river with only 50 miles that are protected. And that is one of the limitations of this policy, but there are other ways in which those types of actions can be mitigated or stopped. At the time that this policy was created, Washington really encouraged the individual states to create their own state scenic, wild and scenic river systems. And at one point in time, there were over 30 of these state scenic systems, but today there's only like a handful, mostly because as state budgets get challenged, they tend to chip away at their conservation systems. That's one of the arguments for having a larger federal policy. But I see that as we move forward, we do need to protect more river resources, that reinvigorating those state systems can also, and creating more systems in the states that don't have such policies, can really be beneficial to the overall goal of conservation. There are some really unique water specific policies in the country that several states have that are like a high water quality policy. Michigan has one, Oregon has one, where and I'm forgetting the name exactly of these.
We have one in Florida called Outstanding Florida Waters. And so they have like a special, a more advanced permitting requirement, for example.
Exactly. So implementing policies such as those, along with the more river specific conservation policy, kind of a combination of different policies can really help to achieve this overall agenda of protecting water resources. I would say that as countries think about adopting our policy, we have what we have, but there's no reason why they couldn't go ahead and include a higher water quality standard in their version of a wild and scenic river system. And I would also encourage countries to think beyond that quarter-mile riparian area and think more broadly, and think about protecting more of a larger swath of land on either side of the river corridor. In the case of China, what they're considering for their rivers is actually protecting and limiting development in the entire river basin. So the Qingzhou River, for example, all the tributaries are protected, and development is limited within that entire basin. Hi, Ted.
Hi, Danielle. That was thank you very much. And I've heard you speak one other time, but I learned a lot more this time. This is a much more wide-ranging talk than the one that you gave on your work in China, which I know is just starting. I just want to make a comment, and then I have to go on to another call in about 3 minutes. But one of the highlights of my trip in 2014 to Palmas was Ellie took us on a field trip to the Legiado Dam on the Tocantins River. And I wasn't really thinking there would be any discussion with the dam operators about things like recreational sandbars and beaches. I thought it was mostly going to be a discussion about fish and water supply and energy. But I learned that there had been a discourse that went on between the dam operators and the municipalities, which are affected by the fluctuating flows of the dam. And actually there had been an agreement after some period of time to reoperate the dam on weekends during certain parts of the year to allow people more ready access to swimming beaches, I guess, as I understood it. I thought that was really remarkable. And it was kind of a real-time, informal case study on adaptive management. And so when we're in Palmas, I really encourage you to ask about that a little bit. I don't know if it's documented or what sort of agreement was put in place, but my understanding was that the dam operators agreed on weekends to change their operations to allow people to better enjoy the rivers by having
recreational flows. Yeah, permitting those recreational flows. That's great. That's what you could hope for, right? When you already have a dam in place, is working with the community to meet everybody's needs. Yeah.
And I also remember we had a farewell dinner on the banks of the very same river. So I was just really impressed. I mean, I don't know all of the details of recreational use of rivers in Brazil, but my sense from the culture and the people I met was that it's hugely important culturally, recreationally, and in all ways. I don't know if there's river running or river rafting, but I just encourage you to look into that a little bit when you're in Palmas, because I found it a really intriguing and uplifting story about how people were able to get better access to their recreational beaches, which they'd always had access to, but were curtailed by the operation of the dam under fluctuating flows. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ted.
Is there time for another one? Hi, this is...
I guess we have time for one more question, and then we have to end. And I would have a question for Denielle, but I can ask her.
Hi, Danielle.
Is it Monty?
Yes, this is Monty Aguirre, and I work with International Rivers. And
Hola, Monty. ¿Cómo estás?
Bien, vale, gracias.
Can you speak a little louder, Monty, please?
Yes, sure. I'll get closer here. But so I work with International Rivers, and for many years we've been fighting dams, as you probably know, hydropower projects that are, damaging to the rivers. And we've been successful to some degree, but also even in times when that has happened, there's a noise there. Even in times when we've been successful, let's say, working with communities and NGOs and so forth, and tons of lawyers, the dams do come back like we say, like zombies, and with slightly different name. I mean, Xingu, on the Xingu, Belo Monte had another name before, etc. And so based on that, and I've been working with International Rivers for 20 years now. Actually, a few years ago, I saw that we need to go case, but that we also needed to work on something broader, going to something, and also looking and admiring the wild and scenic rivers system and learning from that. And so that's one of the things that we're doing. We are perhaps a little bit more advanced in Chile now. We already have sort of the strategy that we've been developing is first some legal studies, and then arriving to a draft law bill. And that we already have done in Chile, and studies in legal studies on water policies, water laws, where there are in Colombia and Peru. And then other parts of the strategies are, of course, working with the movement, working with the people that care about these rivers or whose rivers these are, and strengthening their movements, communications, of course, and we're still need to do a lot of that, and of course advocacy and lobbying when our partners can do that. We can't do that, but we can help to develop some of the instruments and tools and educational and communicational pieces. And then, of course, like you mentioned, the science and technology. And one of the things that I was also talking to the Forest Service and realizing, like, of course, back then, 50 years ago, they were not using the whole concept of ecosystem services as we do today, that we needed to go in that direction. And even looking into valuation, cost-benefit analysis. I mean, basically developing any argument possible that we can present to decision makers to convince them that this is the way to go. So, and we're trying to do that also in other countries. I'll be putting you in contact with our person in China, and where you might know also about the New River, where there's, they're seeking protection through a national park. But the problem that we find throughout the world is that national parks don't protect the waterways generally.
Right.
I haven't found that. So that's something that most probably we'll have to, work on at the national level. But okay, probably my time is up, but I just, I'll be looking to talk to you some more. And this was a great presentation.
Thank you, Monty. Nice to hear from you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I just had a comment because the other day we were talking about how we can communicate better across divides and across, political parties and across divisions to make that message go through and I don't know, to frame our values in a way that makes sense, and then we can maybe achieve some common goals that we think are not common, but depending on the way you frame it. And I was just thinking, do we have enough data? Because I think data is also very powerful in that sense, especially in Brazil. It's not going to make things change per se, but over time, like you've shown, through time, also things change, and we have to keep pushing and keep showing and keep collecting that data and communicating, right? That's kind of our role as well in academia and as engaged scientists. But I was just thinking how important it is and how challenging, for example, for us in the Amazon is to have that type of data. So if I have that question, if a politician asks you a question, how much, how many people does this river provide water and food security to? What is the value or what is the monetary value of the food security service that this river provides? And I was just thinking in my mind, do we have the data? Are we collecting the type of data that we have? Because of course you can talk about it, but when you present the data, when you present in terms of monetary value, it's much more powerful.
Absolutely, yeah. And so critics of ecosystem service valuation would say that there's a danger in putting a number value on any particular service, because then a development interest could say, well, my development is worth so many $1 million more than that little service, and so we should move forward with the development. But generally, what I have seen is that when you combine the valuation of the many different services together, it's a very compelling argument that an integral ecosystem is extremely valuable. And, the idea here is we're not going to stop all the dams in the world, and we shouldn't, but we should be really strategic about where they get built and how they get built. And by taking this IWRM framework into consideration and thinking about ecosystem services and climate adaptation, it can, using the river basin as that organizing principle, then we can come up with a policy that works for the specific country and their governing structure, their water laws, their property laws, and think about, okay, based on all of these policy layers and our development interests, where can we identify rivers that would be better used for water development projects, and those rivers that should be left alone because people are depending on them for other reasons that are not translatable. A dam can get built anywhere, more or less, but a person's culture can't necessarily translate from one place to another. Species don't necessarily exist from one river to another, and those are compelling arguments. So using ecosystem service framework as what is called a boundary object, this object that allows for people on both sides of the boundary to have a conversation about this, is actually really powerful. I think it's a really powerful tool.
Thank you very much. I think we have to end now, but whoever is interested can send an email to Denielle. I'm sure she'll be happy to answer email questions. I think the chat is always and yes.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you,
thank
everyone.
you very much. And see you soon. Next time, I should continue with this webinar series. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. So I'm going to stop recording.